So, how long have you lived in Western North Carolina, and what brought you here?
Sure. I moved to Asheville in the summer of 2000, in June, very end of June. And I moved here sight unseen. I'd heard about Asheville from friends. I moved from Gainesville, Florida, another university town. And I moved here because I had a few friends who'd moved to Asheville, and also I had met some people at a lesbian writers conference who lived in Asheville, and I really wanted to get out of Gainesville because I'd lived in Florida for my whole life. At the time, I was 28. And I was ready for a few different kinds of changes, and one of them was I wanted to leave Florida. I'd stayed there longer than I intended to as an adult. I wanted to get somewhere that had a moderate climate and a moderate topography, something that wasn't flat and didn't have two seasons, wet and dry, and Asheville seemed to fill the bill. It didn't get too cold in the winter. The mountains were beautiful. And then my friends who had moved to Asheville were a mix of people, but all of them had a common thread in that they were creative types. And my friend Pete in particular, he and his friend Sharon moved here prior to me moving, and he said, "You've got to come up here. It's just a beautiful community. They've got old buildings there still. The mountains are gorgeous, and I think it's a place where your art career could take off and thrive if you wanted to do that." So couple that with a brief love interest that was somewhat flickering up here. I thought, it's a good enough time to move. So I packed myself, my dog, and my two motorcycles up and moved moved to Asheville, just kind of sight unseen, just sort of trusting the literal half dozen friends, the handful of friends who gave it glowing reviews. So that's when I got here, and that's kind of how I got here initially. The other piece of that's pretty big in the reasons why I moved was that I knew that there was at least one, if not two, transgender guys who lived up here, and it had become apparent to me that that's what I was I was exploring that path, and I needed to be able to see people and meet people in person. There was not the incredible font of information of an internet happening then, and communities were smaller, and we really had to seek each other out, and I've always been somebody who needs to make a physical connection. So just on hearing that was possible in Asheville, I thought, okay, that's where I'm going.
What has changed in a positive way since you arrived here some 18 years ago?
What has changed in a positive way?
For you?
For me,
in your life?
For me in my life, I think that I'm trying to think about whether this is restricted to Asheville or whether it's society at large. I think there's a larger degree of knowledge out in the world around transgender people and transgender issues, and sometimes that's beneficial and sometimes that's downright harmful. I think that in North Carolina in particular, the passage of HB2 has been incredibly harmful to our LGBTQ plus community. So I think there's been some steps forward and some steps back. I think that Asheville has an interesting thing that happens in it, in that everybody feels that because we are such an accepting place and community that queer people can go anywhere and do anything, and there's less bias because of that in the popular view and opinion, that we then don't get protections enacted because people think, oh, it's an accepting place, there's not really a problem, we don't need to press for this, which isn't actually accurate in my opinion. And I also think that that also makes it so that there's fewer gathering points or places of connection for the queer community. And I'm speaking, I guess, just specifically to that experience. One of the neat things that I think exists in Western North Carolina is there are some really cool things about Southern culture that exist here because we're in the South. I've lived in the South my whole life, but in this area, as in many areas that border on the rural, you're oftentimes dependent upon your neighbor for things. So you have to have a certain level of acceptance because we are all interconnected. And I think that's something that informs how our community exists and coexists with other communities. And that because in the South we do have such a paucity of resources, I think overall, and then most specifically for the LGBTQ population or community, that we really have to be good stewards of what we do have, what resources we have, whether those are financial or whether those are physical resources or resources of connection and networks and communities, so that we can survive and thrive.
You mentioned gathering places earlier. Are those categories you just talked to physical gathering places, communities? Could you expound on that a little bit?
Sure. Thinking about the LGBTQ community in particular, I think looking at the recent historical arc, the place, certainly when I was growing up, and definitely prior to that, the place that you found community was in bars, right? So not really the most healthy place if you want to pursue a career or a life or a family sometimes, and I think that's one of the reasons why alcoholism is something that has had an interesting role in the LGBTQ community, alcohol consumption, and how companies now target the LGBTQ community. But that was the place where you could meet other people and find other people. I think for a while there was a boom with bookstores that has waned definitely in recent years. And, certainly Malaprops was, I think, the business that anchored downtown Asheville and began the resurgence, the renaissance, the gentrification. And it started as a lesbian bookstore owned and operated. And at that, my awareness of bookstores, I guess, was in the 80s and 90s, and there were, close to 100 across the country, and Malaprops was one of them. And now there's maybe 10.
Yeah.
So I think that's a place that we no longer see people gathering. And the bookstores that have survived are ones that have diversified and have brought in other communities and don't cater exclusively to the LGBTQ community. I think in some larger urban areas we see LGBTQ centers, but in areas that are limited in geography, as we are bounded by the mountains, and maybe don't have access to as many resources as communities with larger economic bases do. It's hard to launch an LGBTQ center of some sort. So not having that is challenging. I think interesting things have sprung up from the internet, and I think that meeting spaces for newer generations are more meeting places of the mind, and of interaction that can happen online, and you can communicate with people and form close bonds and never have been in the same room with them, and it's not bounded by geography either, which I think is fascinating, because I am somebody who does like to be in the same space with somebody.
Yeah.
So it's a shift, it's an evolution, but I continue to believe in the fact that it's vital for us to be able to see each other and be with each other and give each other support and have physical interactions where we can exchange molecules and cells with a handshake or a hug or a greeting. And
Having described that change, what do you see as, or maybe promising future directions in Asheville that you'd like to see? that would help the LGBTQ community?
That's a great question. That's something that I ponder frequently as I try to help create that or curate that if I can. And I think, finding events that appeal to a wide swath of who we are, that's the key. And that can be challenging. We have people from all different backgrounds who make up our contingency, and to find something that's going to appeal to everybody is challenging. And then when we get to the level of what's going to be a safe space or a safer space for most people, where people are going to feel that they can come and express themselves and be who they are and not receive any sort of censure, is very important. And I think that we see a lot of conflicts within our own community. So those are the challenges. So what would that be, or what would that look like? Could there be an event of some sort that was of a short duration that would attract everybody at the same time, or could there be a launch of a center? I don't know. Those are some ideas.
Okay.